So the question that we now have to ask is, can God come into this world? I want to discover God together. I want to understand who He can be together. Now, remember what we just talked about with Tawheed. There's a lot of disagreement throughout Islamic history and even today on Tawheed. Let's talk about the Old Testament version of this issue. Let's talk about what the Old Testament says, because that's what Christianity is built on, Judaism. So what does the Old Testament have to say? Can God come into the world? The answer is yes, many times over, yes. God comes in the garden with Adam. Jacob wrestles with God. God calls out from a bush. He shows up as a pillar of fire and cloud. God appears to the elders, Exodus says, and also God walks in front of Moses. There are many examples. These are just the first few books of the Old Testament and what I found in those. So can God come into this world? The answer is, Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir. God is able to do anything that He wants to do. All the disciples ran away from Jesus. When He was arrested, they were fearful. They didn't know what was going on. Of course, we know John watched the crucifixion, and we do know that Peter came to the trial scene, but at least at that time, they all ran away. However, after the resurrection, these men were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Whether I live or die, it is for Christ that I live and for Christ that I die. And so do you, whether you realize it or not. You are so much more than you think. My brother or my sister, how much I wish, if you feel like you're not worth anything, if you feel like there's no purpose for you, if you feel like no one loves you, how much I wish I could just spend time with you and hug you and tell you about Jesus. But that's who you need to be, doing that for others. That's who we all need to be, doing this for this hurting world. You are loved. You are eternal. You are more valuable than anything you've ever seen. You're made in the image of God. Let's live according to that truth. So who is Jesus? Who is this guy? Now, growing up, I thought that He was just a prophet. I thought He was just someone who was teaching the good news. But when we look at what Jesus claimed to be, He claimed to be God Himself. Now, I don't have too much time. I've got so much I need to share with you. I only have 15 minutes left. But I just want to fast forward to what it means for us, because this is life-changing. Okay, what it means for us is God incarnate has come to this world. God Himself, the creator of the universe, has come to this world. Now, who is God? Because He's not like us, insofar as you and I, we're one being and we're one person. Okay, we're one being. I'm a human being, and I'm one person. I'm Nabil Qureshi. That's who I am. God's not like that. God is one being. He's God, but He's three persons: Father, Son, and Spirit.
The word Trinity itself, it doesn't appear as a theological term till near the end of the 2nd century after Jesus.
First, I want to point out you are absolutely right. The term Trinity is not used till the end of the 2nd century. What is the doctrine of God called in the Quran? In Islam, what is the doctrine of God called?
Tawheed.
Tawheed. Is that in the Quran?
No,
the word Tawheed.
The word Tawheed is a derived word from Ahad.
Alhamdulillah, good. So you understand, the word Tawheed is not itself in the Quran. In the same way, the word Trinity is not itself in the Bible. This doesn't pose a problem. The Shahada is not found in the Quran. You have the components of the Shahada in the Quran, but you do not, you do not have La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah in that way found in the Quran. The components are found in the Quran. With the Trinity, the components are found in the Bible.
God Himself, the creator of the universe, has come to this world. Now, who is God? Because He's not like us, insofar as you and I, we're one being and we're one person. Okay? We're one being. I'm a human being, and I'm one person. I'm Nabil Qureshi. That's who I am. God's not like that. God is one being. He's God, but He's three persons: Father, Son, and Spirit. What He is God, and there's only one what. There's only one God. So don't ever get this wrong, especially if you're talking to a Muslim, because Muslims will ask questions, how can God be three? No, there's one God, there's one being, just like I am one being, but there's three persons. Father, Son, and Spirit.
Think about this. As a Muslim, my whole life, I believe that God sat on his throne and he would never enter into this world, and he ruled us from above, and he gave us a bunch of things to do, and he would judge us at the end of time. But this story is that God was willing to enter into this world, in a filthy world. And he was willing to live as a carpenter, blue-collar laborer, and he's willing to live with people who would ultimately betray him. And then he's willing to go to a cross and suffer and die for the sake of sinners. Our God, who created the universe, all the stars in the sky, he just thought them into existence. That God is willing to die. And as he tells us that he loves us so much, he's willing to die for us, this is what he says: as I have loved you, so love one another.
So what I am is a human being, that's my being. Who I am is Nabil, that's my person. The two are not the same thing. All of us in here share essentially the same type of being that we are. We are human beings, but none of you share essentially the same kind of person that I am. We're all different persons. So the characteristic of a being is very different from that of a person. I am one being with one person. God is one being with three persons: Father, Son, and Spirit. Is there anything like that on this earth? No. But does that mean God cannot be one being in three persons? Absolutely. It means he can be that if that's what he is. There's no way we can know these deeper things about God apart from revelation.
It didn't take me long to get to Matthew chapter 5, where it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And when I saw those words, it was like electric on the page, and it like jumped off the page and started my heart. That's what it felt like.
Hi, Nabil. How would you answer my Saudi exchange student who has read your book and said, but he's Ahmadiyyat instead of Shia or Sunni?
So some people, thanks for the question. Many people will they'll point to the sect and they'll say, Nabil's sect is not a sect that we agreed with. And I'll say, I could defend that. I could say, no, that's a problematic position, but I'm not going to. I'll do the even if argument, and I'll say, even if you're right, and my sect is a different enough form of Islam that it doesn't apply, that doesn't change any of the arguments. The arguments are still the same. So the arguments for the Quran, the arguments against the Quran, the arguments for Muhammad or against Muhammad, my sect of Islam, no one's sect of Islam makes a difference on that. By the way, there are many sects on Islam. If you want to learn more about that, buy a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I've read that one. Yeah, that's good.
I've met the author.
I've got another Twitter.
If I have offended anyone tonight, if I have upset anyone, or if I have said anything incorrect, it wasn't my intention. I have come to do the absolute best I could to represent the truth. If you feel I have offended you, I wouldn't mind hearing about it. If you feel I have said something incorrect, I wouldn't mind hearing. In fact, I would love to hear it. If I said something incorrect, please correct me so that I can speak more accurately in the future. I pray that God would bless you all with a true, abundant joy that comes from Him and Him alone, and that you would know Him to the full. Thank you so much. So at a young age, I'm reading books that are teaching me things about Christianity, giving me Bible verses to quote to explain to people why the gospel is false. And so when I'd get to school, I'd have conversations with friends. I remember a very specific one from 11th grade. It was in my Latin class, and there was a girl in front of me who I thought was a bit crazy. She had this kind of look on her face, like she was at total peace all the time, and you just kind of wanted to smack her. You're like, wake up. And when she talked to you, she talked with this kind of passion and conviction. We thought she was crazy. Turned out she was on fire for the Lord, but it looks the same if you don't know what that is. And so she turns around one day and she says to me, Nabil, can I ask you a question? I said, go ahead. She says, do you know Jesus? But according to the Islamic sources, the Quran was compiled not by Muhammad's successor. There was a version compiled by his successor, but the final version was compiled by the third successor. And what he did, if you want evidence, by the way, for this, go to the book of Hadith, which is the book of traditions on Muhammad, that is the most trustworthy according to Sunni Muslims. It's called Sahih al-Bukhari. Go to volume 6, book 61, and read Hadith number 509 and 510. So 661, 509, 510, it shows you that Uthman was willing to collect all the early Quranic manuscripts. He said, make one version of the Quran,
and then burn all the evidence.
Why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus? He had no psychological phenomenon that would explain this. He hadn't followed Jesus for 3 years. He hadn't given his life to Jesus, as it were. Yet even Paul is willing to go to his death because Jesus is risen.
And so that's kind of the point here. For example, if you take a look at my family, my father is greater than I am in my family. He's my father. He's the leader of our family, so he's greater than I am in role. But my father is just as human as I am. So we're equal in substance, but my father is greater in role than me. So when Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, he's talking about the Father's role. He's not talking about his substance. He's equal in substance. And so we need to explain that. The term Son of God throws Muslims off. So explain the Trinity, explain that, know it yourself to be able to explain it.
We're going to take one more question. We have a couple important last things we want to do.
I think the first thing you should do is say hi. And then you say, hey, I live down the street from you. Do you live here? How long have you lived here? What do you do? Just strike up a conversation. The people are people at the end of the day. They want to be loved. They want to be known. Live life together, which is what Jesus did. In Mark chapter 2, from the very beginning, people are saying, what is he doing? Why is he eating dinner with these sinners and tax collectors? It's because he's living life with those who need it. It is not the healthy who need a doctor. It is those who are sick.
Where you do, and we're judged at the end of life. If our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, we make it into heaven. If they don't, then we're in trouble. And of course, genuine Christianity is a whole different system. It's, as someone has said, it's not do, D-O, it's done, D-O-N-E, because it's based on what Christ has done.
And that's what flips Christianity and puts it on a whole different scale than everything else, because within the Christian faith, it's God has done this for you,
yes,
as opposed to you having to earn the favor yourself.
Yeah.
So Muslims believe that Allah has sent Adam, that Allah has sent Noah, that Allah sent Moses, that Allah sent Joseph. All these names that you find in the Old Testament, you'll find them in the Quran. 24 prophets from the Old Testament. Islam subsumes their names into the Quran. So I think it's a good idea to take advantage of, not in a bad way, but take advantage of some of these points of commonality. When you do have these discussions, you might get to a point of tension, but just remember to be gracious. And before heading into these conversations, I have found this with my family, I've found this with Muslims I discuss with. Before you speak to anyone about Jesus, speak to Jesus about them. Go in prayer, let the Holy Spirit lead and guide and give discernment, and these conversations will be very fruitful. It's important to be able to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity if you believe in it. If you believe in it, be able to articulate it. Otherwise, you don't really know what you believe in, and you don't actually believe it. You want to believe it, but you don't know what it is. So be able to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is the belief that God is one in being and three in person. One in being and three in person. So right off the bat, it's not a contradiction. Because if I were to say it's one in being and three in being, that is a contradiction. It's one in being and three in person. So what's the difference between a being and a person? A being is that quality or that essence or that substance, whatever you want to call it. A being is that which makes you what you are. And a person is that quality or that essence that makes you whom you are.
First, let's start with Christianity. What are the sources regarding Christianity? And some of you might be even asking, Nabil, why should I even believe Jesus is real? Why should I ever even believe that he's a man who existed? The first thing I'm going to start off by telling you is that it is incontrovertible according to the historical principles of investigation that a man named Jesus existed in the first century. How do we know this? We have over 40 records of Jesus' life from ancient times describing this man who is essentially a carpenter in Palestine. He didn't have much of anything. He wasn't a centrally important figure at the time, yet we have 40 sources that refer to him. 10 for Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, 40 for Jesus. You can see we have excellent reason to believe that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and existed in the first century.
Now, by the way, I want to clarify something though. The moment she asked me if I believed in Jesus, my respect for her went up. Because I took a look at all the people in my class who called themselves Christian, and I knew that they believed in order for me to go to heaven, I had to believe in Jesus. But none of them have ever asked me that.
So I thought one of two things must be true. Either they don't really believe their faith, or they don't care if I go to hell. If you as a Christian did not ask me if I believed in Jesus, then I believed either you didn't really believe your faith or you didn't care if I went to hell. So David and I are going home from a very manly place. On the way back, David asks me, he says, Nabil, we've been looking into this for quite a while. Where do you think the case for Christianity falls? From 0 to 100, where do you think the case for Christianity stands? I just thought about each criterion there. Well, it's 99% sure Jesus died on the cross, about 90% sure he claimed to be God, 90% sure he rose from the dead. I'm putting it at 80 to 85%, David. And he looks at me and he says, Nabil, well, why don't you accept the gospel then? And I said, David, it's because I'm 100% sure in Islam. Even if I'm 80 to 85% believing in the case of Christianity, the case for Islam is stronger. And he looked at me and he said, Nabil, you haven't even looked critically at the case for Islam. And I said, I know, but I'm just that certain. I've heard evidences of the Quran from childhood. I've heard evidences of Muhammad from childhood. I am certain that Islam is true. And he says, well, put it to the test. And here's the critical thing. He says, test it to the same degree you tested Christianity.
And the other sets of arguments I used was on Muhammad. I believed, having been raised as a Muslim, that Muhammad was the best man who ever walked this earth. Al-Insan al-Kamil, the perfect man. This is the man who's the perfect exemplar. As I was taught Muhammad and I was taught Islam, Muhammad was the most peaceful man who ever lived. He's the most generous man who ever lived. He's the most loving, the most kind, the most humble. He took care of women, who took care of orphans, took care of widows. Muhammad was the best statesman. He was the best diplomat. He was the best general. It doesn't matter what epithet you throw at him, he deserves it because he's Muhammad. He's the chief of the prophets. That's what we believed. But what do the earliest sources say about Muhammad? And how reliable are those sources? We're going to take a look at that tonight. And we're going to take a look at the sources for the Quran.
If you define Islam as that religious system which the Muhammad in the pages of history left behind, there's no question that it's violent. If I were to become a Christian, that would mean that I was throwing my whole family under the bus. Not only am I going to destroy my own reputation in the Islamic community with everyone around me that I know, but that also means that my mother, who's the daughter of a Muslim missionary, everything she has done in her life has been done partially to build her reputation within the Islamic community. If her only son becomes a Christian, that throws everything she's done into the trash. Does that make sense? Am I willing to not just do this to me, but to do this to my mom and to do this to my dad as the only son in our family? These are the issues I'm wrestling with, and it's hurting, and that's why I'm asking God for more dreams, more visions, asking Him to give me more and more. But at a certain point, enough's enough, and the Lord stopped giving me more, and so that's when I realized I had to do what I had to do.
My sister, for example, raised in the exact same household as I am, she said to me one day, Nabil, I do believe God made you a Christian. I'm like, what? And she said, yeah, there's many paths that lead to God. God wants you to be a Christian. He wants me to be a Muslim. I'm like, you didn't get that from Islam. You got that from Oprah. But that's what she believes, and she thinks it's in the Quran, even though it's not. So there's a new generation coming. But the key is, and I can't emphasize this enough, when you meet Muslims, don't think you know what they think. You don't, and sometimes they don't. But you need to talk with them and ask them about their lives, what they believe.
And how long did David befriend you? How long was this conversation before you and ultimately came to
It was
Christ?
over 4 years before I became a believer.
Yeah.
And so you look at the broader context of that verse, you can't possibly say that Jesus is denying to be God. So point out context. Whenever someone asks about a biblical verse, say that is a great question. Let's read what the Bible says. And take a look at that whole chapter. There's no way someone can read that chapter, see what Jesus says, and walk away saying Jesus is anything but God. And so that's kind of the point here. For example, if you take a look at my family, my father is greater than I am in my family. He's my father. He's the leader of our family, so he's greater than I am in role. But my father is just as human as I am. So we're equal in substance, but my father is greater in role than me. So when Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, he's talking about the Father's role. He's not talking about his substance. He's equal in substance. And so we need to explain that. The term Son of God throws Muslims off. So explain the Trinity, explain that, know it yourself to be able to explain it.
We're going to take one more question. We have a couple important last things we want to do.
I want to encourage you. The Quran and the Bible are not the same book, of course, but a lot of times we come to them exegetically as if they were. Muslims and Christians will come to the Quran exegeting them as if they were their own book, or they'll come to the Bible exegeting it as if it was the Quran. You need the Hadith to exegete the Quran because one verse does not necessarily relate to the next. Bible's not like that. In the Bible, the Gospel of John, John 1:1 relates to John 21. It's all related. So you need to read the whole book before you try to pull a part out and exegete it. And I'm not saying cherry picking is necessarily a negative intention. It's just what happens when you've exegeted the Quran that way for so long.
If you take a look at what the disciples emphasized, it was that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's the reason we can have confidence in our faith.
And so this is what I was going through as a Muslim, encountering this information. At the same time, my Christian friend was introducing me to good reasons to believe in Christianity. I had been taught growing up that the Bible was corrupted. He showed me that that's simply not true. In fact, if I used the arguments consistently and I said, the Bible was corrupted, actually I was condemning the Quran far more so. Because the same arguments I was using on the Bible is actually much more applicable to the Quran, although I had no idea.
Let's first take a look at Muhammad's life. The earliest source on Muhammad's life is Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq wrote somewhere around 150 years after Muhammad died. But what did the people at that time say? Let me clarify for you. We don't actually have Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. What we have is a recension by a man named Ibn Hisham. So Ibn Hisham saved Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. And here is what Ibn Hisham says. He says, I found in Ibn Ishaq's work things that were so offensive, so impossible, that I have taken them out. What is left is those things that I have found true.
Fight the Jews and Christians because Islam has been made to prevail over every other. Now I'm seeing this as a Muslim, and this is all shocking to me. I'm learning this, and it's shocking to me because I didn't know this growing up. And then I get to chapter 9, verse 111 of the Quran, which says that Allah has saved you, that's the Christianese way of saying it, Allah has bought your persons and your property for this, that you might slay in battle and be slain. Allah has made you Muslim so you can slay in battle and be slain. That's what chapter 9, verse 111 says. Incidentally, it's the same verse that says if you die in jihad, you will go to heaven. The only guarantee given in the Quran of going to heaven. This was earth-shattering for me.
But according to the Islamic sources, the Quran was compiled not by Muhammad's successor. There was a version compiled by his successor, but the final version was compiled by the third successor. And what he did, if you want evidence, by the way, for this, go to the book of Hadith, which is the book of traditions on Muhammad. That is the most trustworthy, according to Sunni Muslims. It's called Sahih al-Bukhari. Go to volume 6, book 61, and read Hadith number 509 and 510. So 661, 509, 510, it shows you that Uthman was willing to collect all the early Quranic manuscripts. He said, make one version of the Quran and then burn all the evidence.
Why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus? He had no psychological phenomenon that would explain this. He hadn't followed Jesus for 3 years. He hadn't given his life to Jesus, as it were. Yet even Paul is willing to go to his death because Jesus is risen.
And so that's kind of the point here. For example, if you take a look at my family, my father is greater than I am in my family. He's my father. He's the leader of our family, so he's greater than I am in role. But my father is just as human as I am. So we're equal in substance, but my Father is greater in role than me. So when Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, he's talking about the Father's role. He's not talking about his substance. He's equal in substance. And so we need to explain that. The term Son of God throws Muslims off. So explain the Trinity, explain that, know it yourself to be able to explain it.
We're going to take one more question. We have a couple important last things we want to do.
So in the midst of me challenging him and asking him questions, which, by the way, if you've encountered Muslims in the West, they tend to be very, very informed on how to challenge Christians in their faith. So I was not an anomaly. When I was challenging him in his faith, 9/11 happened. And then he started asking me questions. He said, Nabil, how can you say Islam's a religion of peace? And I'd give him the spiel. And then he'd say, yeah, Nabil, I get that. I get what you're saying, but what about those verses in the Quran that those terrorists are reciting? What about those teachings of Muhammad's life that they're referring to?
And I would do whatever I could. I would read defenses that my teachers and my imams gave me, and I would ask the scholars around me, how do I respond to his questions? And I'd give him the responses. But as he was asking these questions, now I was also internally beginning to wonder as well, is what I have been taught, is what I have been received true? Or is there more to this story? What's the second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Quran? The second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Quran is that there are scientific miracles found in the Quran. In other words, there's such advanced science found in the Quran that it could not have been written by a man who was just a man, who only had human knowledge. Either he had prophetic knowledge, thereby making Muhammad the prophet, or the Quran is inspired by Allah, and so you have the inspiration of the Quran. And the arguments that are used is, for example, the Quran has miraculous knowledge about the oceans. The Quran has miraculous knowledge about the atmosphere. The Quran has miraculous knowledge about X, Y, and Z. I believed this as a Muslim. In fact, there's a whole book published on this by a French physician named Maurice Bucaille, and it's called The Quran, the Bible and Science. Anecdotally, I've heard, and from my own experiences, that 70% of people who leave Islam and come to Christ had a dream of some sort, because that's how they're expecting God to speak with them. And it's not a misplaced expectation. My dad received plenty of prophetic dreams when I was a kid. My mom received plenty of prophetic dreams when I was a kid. We often knew what was going to happen because of these dreams. I'm not here to speculate why we got those dreams, but that is just what happened. So I asked God to guide me through visions and dreams, and ultimately God gave me a vision in 3 dreams, which showed me that Christianity was the truth, that the gospel message was the true message. I wish I could go into the details, but we don't have time right now. So after doing all this studying first for years, it brought me to the altar of Christ, and then I started asking for dreams and visions, and he gave me dreams and visions, placing me right in the middle of a biblical parable I had never read. But you can't just convert. So whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, whether you're neither, find the truth, search the truth. Don't have these questions ring around in your mind and not address them. A question under the surface left will fester like an infection. And even if you don't see it, it is destroying your flesh. It is destroying you to your bones. Air those doubts. Discuss them so that you can be solid, so that you can know with certainty. And pursue God, pursue truth by all means, because God is the most beautiful, unimaginably wonderful being in this universe. And if He created you, if He gave you everything you have, I would challenge you to say you owe it to Him to find out who He is. Or you can walk away. The choice is truly yours. Thank you. And in that moment, I realized that this God is worth everything. This story is worth sharing with our lives. Oh, and our lives are in His hands. And if we die today, we're going to be taken care of. But there are millions, in fact, billions of people for whom that is not the case. And if we lived every second of our lives for their sakes, only then would we truly honor this God who was willing to live the life we should have lived, to die the death that we should have died. That's our God. And that's my story. So let's pray together. So the question we have to ask ourselves then, now I believe this. I didn't used to believe this. I used to be Muslim, but after having studied Muhammad's life, after having studied Jesus' life, I have concluded that Jesus is the most important person who ever walked this earth. The words that He spoke are the words that we ought to pay careful attention to. His actions we ought to observe and emulate. His character we ought to aspire to. That's who Jesus is. We need to be like Christ. So the question that we now have to ask is, can God come into this world? I want to discover God together. I want to understand who He can be together. Now, remember what we just talked about with Tawheed. There's a lot of disagreement throughout Islamic history and even today on Tawheed. Let's talk about the Old Testament version of this issue. Let's talk about what the Old Testament says, because that's what Christianity is built on, Judaism. So what does the Old Testament have to say? Can God come into the world? The answer is yes, many times over, yes. God comes in the garden with Adam. Jacob wrestles with God. God calls out from a bush. He shows up as a pillar of fire and cloud. God appears to the elders, Exodus says, and also God walks in front of Moses. There are many examples. These are just the first few books of the Old Testament and what I found in those. So can God come into this world? The answer is, Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir. God is able to do anything that he wants to do. All the disciples ran away from Jesus. When he was arrested, they were fearful. They didn't know what was going on. Of course, we know John watched the crucifixion, and we do know that Peter came to the trial scene, but at least at that time, they all ran away. However, after the resurrection, these men were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Whether I live or die, it is for Christ that I live and for Christ that I die. And so do you, whether you realize it or not. You are so much more than you think. My brother or my sister, how much I wish, if you feel like you're not worth anything, if you feel like there's no purpose for you, if you feel like no one loves you, how much I wish I could just spend time with you and hug you and tell you about Jesus. But that's who you need to be, doing that for others. That's who we all need to be, doing this for this hurting world. You are loved. You are eternal. You are more valuable than anything you've ever seen. You are made in the image of God. Let's live according to that truth.
When we take a look at Islam, which comes 600 years after Jesus, 600 miles away from Jesus, what it says about Jesus is not historically sound. Could it still be true? Of course, it could still be true, but we'd have to throw out history in order for it to be true. And I start reading the pages of Scripture, encountering this God, and God's pretty awesome. This was a study Bible that my friend David had given me. I would, out of exasperation, I'd say something like, God, how do I know you can even hear me when I pray? And I'd read the footnote. If you want to know that God hears you when you pray, turn to 1 John 5. Sweet, boom, thanks. I'll start reading. And so I'm going back and forth within the Scripture, and I finally get to Matthew chapter 10. And here's what I read in Matthew chapter 10. He who confesses me before the people of this world, I will confess before my Father in heaven. And he who denies me before the people of this world, I will deny before my Father in heaven.
But then there was this one girl, like you're saying, Betsy, who was different because she always had a smile on her face, which I thought was really weird. Like, why are you always smiling? And she would want to talk about Jesus. And so one day she came up to me in class and she said, do you know Jesus? See, the thing was, though, that my mom had trained me to respond to Christians. Yeah. And Muslims believe in Jesus. They just have a view of Jesus that he was a human, that he was a prophet. And this is what I told her. I said, look, Betsy, as a Muslim, I believe that Jesus was virgin born. I believe he's the Messiah. I believe that he is going to come back at the end of times. I believe that he's able to do miracles like cleanse the lepers and raise the dead and heal the blind. And she had no idea that Muslims believed this. So I said for her, but I also know that he's not God. And she said, no, Nabil, that's the most important part. Jesus is God. Yeah, so Protestants tend to see the Bible and impute that same notion of the Bible to other faiths, but the Islamic way of understanding the Quran and using the Quran was much more as a liturgical device or a totem. So we would memorize the Arabic of the Quran, often not even knowing what it meant.
You had no idea what you were reciting.
Quite often. Now, my mother was very specific in teaching me the translations, and so she would. But most of the people around me didn't actually bother to learn the English translation. Just memorizing the Arabic of the Quran incurred blessings for you when you recited it. And you had to memorize portions of the Quran to pray the 5 daily prayers. So you have to recite from memory portions of the Quran. And that's what the word Quran means, recitation. So even though it's a book that Muslims hold as the inspired word of Allah, the word incarnate, as it were, Muslims generally don't go directly to the Quran for teaching. They go to their imams and their teachers who then distill that information for them.
So by the time I was 5 years old, I had the last 7 chapters of the Quran memorized. And my mom had taught me to recite the Arabic of the Quran, so I had the whole Quran recited in Arabic by the age of 5. Didn't even know how to read English yet, but because Arabic was the language of the Quran, my mom had taught me to recite the scriptures in Arabic. That's what it meant to be a devoted Muslim. For me, in my childhood growing up and everyone around me, that's what it looked like.
You have to give up your family. And that's extremely difficult. I mean, for so many of us, our parents came from Muslim countries with nothing, and they gave everything up for us. And they see our Islamic identity as our love for them. And when I turn around and say, I'm not going to be Christian, I'm not going to be Muslim anymore, they don't just see that as, oh, you're making a decision that you as an individual can make. They see that as, you are betraying all of us, and you don't love us anymore.
So Jesus claims to be God. Now imagine what this is doing to my mind, because I as a Muslim have now come to the conclusion that the New Testament is reliable, and in that New Testament I'm seeing Jesus claim to be God. This makes everything I've ever been taught about Islam false, because we're supposed to revere Jesus. But here's evidence he claimed to be God. How can I do that? And this cognitive dissonance began to drive me nuts. Up until this point, I was just arguing with my friend David. But now I come to the realization that this investigation may very well determine the course of my life.
I prayed and I said, God, can you show me a vision or a dream? That's how our family always prayed for guidance from God. My father always received prophetic dreams when I was a kid. And so I asked God for a vision or a dream. And through a series of visions and dreams, he pointed out to me that Christianity was true. But that even wasn't enough either. Then I asked God for a little bit more, and he led me to the pages of the Bible. And it was in the scripture. As I started reading the Bible for the first time, and I say the first time because up until this point, I'd read the Bible only to try to argue against it.
Yes.
But for the first time, I'm reading the Bible for guidance.
Yes.
And it was like literally life. It was like the living word. Electric.
Yes.
And it was in the pages of scripture that I ultimately decided to make the step.
Good.
When 9/11 happened, everything changed. Everything changed. Because all of a sudden, we felt really vulnerable too. The world has not been the same since then. I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but everything has changed since then. And not only did it change for Americans at large, but it also changed for Muslims in particular in America. Because we felt the same vulnerability everyone else felt, but at the same time, we had to defend our faith from people who started saying, well, how do you explain what these terrorists have done? How can you say Islam is a religion of peace given what they have just done? And so we had to try to reclaim the rhetoric. And one slogan that I remember here was, when someone asks you, were the hijackers Muslim? Your response should be that not only did they hijack planes that day, they also hijacked Islam. Our religion is a religion of peace. And so that's how we were responding to people. And we believed it. These were not lies because we truly believed what we were saying.
So which Son of Man is Jesus referring to? Daniel. Daniel is looking at his vision. He's having a vision, and he sees God, the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped on a throne. And then Daniel says something very interesting. He says, behold, verse 13, chapter 7, behold, I look in my night visions, and one like a son of man came on the clouds of heaven, as only God and divine being comes, and to him, that Son of Man, is given glory, authority, and sovereign power. Then it says, people of every nation and language served him. Stop. Who is the one who receives service in heaven? God. And yet here, the one who looks like a Son of Man, who has glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven, came as God comes, is being served in heaven with the service due only to God by all people of every nation and language. And then it says his kingdom is one that will not pass away, and his dominion will never be destroyed.
My mother had taught me, Nabil, you need to be prepared against Christianity. You need to know why Islam is true. And if anyone ever asks you why Islam is true, you need to be able to give them reasons to defend your Islamic faith. But you also need to be able to challenge people and show them why Christianity is false. So at a young age, I'm reading books that are teaching me things about Christianity, giving me Bible verses to quote to explain to people why the gospel is false.
And yet here, the one who looks like a son of man, who has glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven, came as God comes, is being served in heaven with a service due only to God by all people of every nation and language. And then it says his kingdom is one that will not pass away and his dominion will never be destroyed. Wait a minute. Stop. In the Old Testament, you've got God being worshipped in heaven, and then you have one who looks like a son of man being worshipped in heaven with a service due only to God in his own kingdom. No one tell me that there's no foreshadow of the Trinity in the Old Testament. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, but it's clearly found here as well.
And instead of going to school, actually I turned back around and went back to my apartment because I was a total mess. And I sat down at my couch, I pulled out a Bible and a Quran, and I put them both in front of me, and I said, God, can you just comfort me? You just comfort me. And I opened up the Quran. Understand, when Muslims recite the Quran, they usually do so liturgically. They don't know what they're reciting for the most part. So this was the first time I went to the Quran for personal guidance, to exegete it for personal guidance. As I'm flipping through its pages, I realized there is not a single verse in the Quran designed to comfort a hurting man. Not one. Now, by the way, I want to clarify something though. The moment she asked me if I believed in Jesus, my respect for her went up. Because I took a look at all the people in my class who called themselves Christian, and I knew that they believed in order for me to go to heaven, I had to believe in Jesus. But none of them have ever asked me that. So I thought one of two things must be true. Either they don't really believe their faith, or they don't care if I go to hell. If you as a Christian did not ask me if I believed in Jesus, then I believed either you didn't really believe your faith or you didn't care if I went to hell. There's so much I wish I could tell you, but basically here's what I began to realize, that there are plenty of peaceful verses in the Quran and in the traditions of Muhammad's life, and there are plenty of violent verses and stories, tons. How do you reconcile them? We in the West had been taught that the violent stuff should be seen as all defensive and coming under the lens of the peaceful stuff. The peaceful stuff is the stuff that prevails. But as I was challenging my Christian friend in his faith, he began to show me not 20th, 21st century books written about Muhammad. Those were all very, very much combed through and made palatable to Westerners. He started to say, Nabil, let's look at the sources of Muhammad's life. Let's look at the Quran itself and the Hadith and the Sirah. Let's look at the original stuff. Not what people are writing now, but the original stuff. And so these kinds of considerations make it extremely difficult for a Muslim to consider becoming a Christian. On top of that, there is something called the law of apostasy in Islam. Traditionally speaking, and to be a little bit more specific, all 4 schools of traditional Sunni Islam and all 3 major schools of traditional Shia Islam teach that if you leave Islam, you can be killed in various circumstances. They disagree on the circumstances, but they all agree that it can happen.
Why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus? He had no psychological phenomenon that would explain this. He hadn't followed Jesus for 3 years. He hadn't given his life to Jesus, as it were. Yet even Paul is willing to go to his death because Jesus is risen.
But I'm just that certain. I've heard evidences of the Quran from childhood. I've heard evidences of Muhammad from childhood. I am certain that Islam is true. And he says, well, put it to the test. And here's the critical thing. He says, test it to the same degree you tested Christianity. The same level of skepticism, apply the same historical criteria, and then tell me what you end up with. And I was very confident. I said, sure, no problem. And so I applied the same level of skepticism, historically speaking. I'm going to have to be brief, but here's what I found. When it came to Jesus, I was extremely skeptical of the Gospel of John, for example, because John's Gospel, according to critical scholars now, not according to Christians, but according to critical scholars, John's Gospel is written between 60 and maybe at the latest 70 years after Jesus' death. And so I was critical of John's Gospel. The first time anyone wrote anything about Muhammad's life was 150 years after his death. When I was a Muslim, I used to challenge Christians by saying things like, the word Trinity is not found anywhere in the Bible. I'd say things like the doctrine of the Trinity developed over hundreds of years. But the reason why that felt strong to me was because I was not consistent in my criticism. If I applied the same critical thoughts to Tawheed, here's what I would have found. The word Tawheed is not found in the Quran. In fact, it's not found anywhere in the Hadith. The concept of Tawheed was continuing to be developed for hundreds of years after Muhammad. That's why it wasn't found in Hadith. And in fact, Tawheed is complex both philosophically and theologically. And by the way, it was really easy to mess with Christians on stuff because a lot of people hadn't thought about things. If I just wanted to have a blast, I'd just say the word Trinity. Explain. Most people hadn't thought of it. Say, do you believe in the Trinity? Yes, I do. Well, what is it? God is 3 in 1. Well, he's not a shampoo bottle. What does it mean for God to be 3 in 1? Can you explain that to me? Well, and then I'd get kinds like illustrations. God is like ice and water and vapor. I'm like, no, he's not. God is not like ice and water and vapor. And I said, well, no, he's like an egg. I'm like, this is getting worse. And usually what people would end up with is, well, it's a divine mystery and you have to believe it by faith. And I would say, look, it sounds to me that you're using the word faith as a substitute for ignorance. And I want no part of that faith. That's how I saw Christianity. And each time I had a conversation with Christians, it bolstered my faith as a Muslim. And it made me want to share Islam with people because I saw the Trinity as polytheism, and polytheism is one of the worst kinds of sins.
Why is Jesus saying that I can of my own self do nothing when he's actually God himself?
Exactly, great question. The argument here is that the Jews are saying that you have a demon, that you are not working with God, you're working against God. And Jesus' response is here, look, if I can of my own will do nothing, except through the will of the Father. In other words, he doesn't have a separate will from the Father. Insofar as what he wants to see accomplished, what he wants to see done, he's not standing against his Father's will. So the point he's trying to make is, no, I'm not the devil. I'm not anti-God. I proclaim God. I do his works. I do these healings. I'm not against him. I'm with him. That's the point he's making. And we can read further into that and say, oh, he's not God. But if you do that, you're ignoring the context. You have to let the context speak. And where the context is clearest, that's where exegesis should be the strongest.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. What is the truth about Islam? What is the truth about Muhammad? Because ultimately that's what it boils down to. If you're a Muslim, you're a follower of Muhammad. Yes, there's beliefs about the Quran and about Allah and all that, sure, but you're following Muhammad to get to those beliefs. When you're a Christian, you follow Jesus. So the life of Jesus and the life of Muhammad are very important in these conversations.
When David and I started investigating how to prove whether Islam or Christianity was true, and we turned to the Muslim faith, I started reading the early stories of Muhammad's life for myself, instead of just receiving the stories, reading from beginning to the end.
Doing your own investigation.
And that's when I came across all these stories that no one had shared with me before. Things that made me think, why am I following this man?
Wow.
Everything that I had heard up until then had been very positive, but now I'm hearing stories about him being bewitched, him beheading hundreds of people on the same day, him treating women in certain ways, nothing that I'd ever heard before. And naturally I kind of said, no, that can't be true, that can't be true. But what I later realized was this is coming from the same sources that all the positive stuff that I had learned came from. I have to take it or leave it. I can't selectively cherry pick my prophet. And when I came to that realization, it was a real earthquake for me.
Wow.
That Muhammad in the pages of history was very different from the Muhammad in the hearts of Muslims.
My sister, okay, I shared the gospel with her. I shared the gospel message with her. I sat down and explained it to her because she didn't quite get it. And when I was done, she looked at me and she said, Nabil, that is the most beautiful story I've ever heard. And I was like, and? Don't you think God would be that kind of God who would only write the most beautiful story? And her response was, I see what you're saying, but I just can't believe it. And what is she saying? She is saying, Nabil, I have a husband. I have kids. I have raised them in the Islamic way. I've obligated myself to Islam. My parents, they already felt the loss of you. What would happen if I became a Christian? And who would I turn to? There's no one in the city who's ever reached out to me. No Christian I know here. Where would I go? It's physically almost impossible for me to do this. And so there's a lot that you're asking from someone who is considering accepting Christ.
I say, God, I would have to give up my family. If I confessed you, I would have to give up my family. You know what the next verses say? He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. I said, God, it's not just my family, it's everything. It's my life, everything I know, everything I've worked for. If I became a Christian, I'd have to give it all up. You know what the next verses say? He who does not pick up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. The gospel has been a call to die from the very beginning. Let me repeat that. The gospel has been a call to die from the very beginning.
This was a decision that would cost me everything. My entire family, all my friends, the future that I had planned out, it would change and cost literally everything. Nobody left Islam in the circles that I grew up in. And my mom, being the daughter of a Muslim missionary, and my father being one of the leaders in the mosque, if their one son became Christian, I mean, not only would that make me sacrifice all my social circles, it would drag them through the mud as well. It's an honor-shame culture, and for your only son to become a Christian meant your reputation was gone. So am I willing not just to do this to myself, but to my parents who've done nothing but sacrificially love me since I was a child?
There is a concept of grace in Islam. Now, it's different from the one in Christianity, but let me give you an example of the doctrine of grace in Islam. In Islam, Muslims believe that their salvation is based on their good deeds versus their bad deeds. And if you do more bad deeds than good, you'll go to hell. If you do more good deeds than bad, you'll go to heaven. But Allah is gracious in Islam in that He can overlook some of your bad deeds, and He has the ability to multiply your good deeds if He wants. The Christian concept of grace is different. And there's many, by the way, different views within Christianity, but the one that I espouse is that God is absolutely merciful and absolutely just. So He demands that every single sin be paid for. If He didn't, He wouldn't be just. But He also demands mercy for everyone. Otherwise, He wouldn't be absolutely merciful. And so, in order to reconcile these two things in Christianity, God does demand payment for every sin, but He signs for that sin Himself. He takes that sin upon Himself on the cross.
Yeah, and Muslims believe in Jesus. They just have a view of Jesus that He was a human, that He was a prophet. And this is what I told her. I said, look, Betsy, as a Muslim, I believe that Jesus was virgin born. I believe He's the Messiah. I believe that He is going to come back at the end of times. I believe that He's able to do miracles like cleanse the lepers and raise the dead and heal the blind. And she had no idea that Muslims believed this. So I said for her, but I also know that He's not God. And she said, no, Nabil, that's the most important part. Jesus is God.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what do you do with this Bible verse where Jesus says that He doesn't know when the end of times is? What do you do with this verse where Jesus says that it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature, or that the Father is greater than He is? And with these basic questions, I was able to topple her confidence. And this is what it meant to be a confident Muslim in the context of Christians who hadn't really understood the basis of their faith.
As a Muslim, I believe that the Bible had been corrupted. All right, the New Testament's corrupt, the Old Testament corrupt, it's all corrupt. The only thing Allah has guarded is the discernment. According to Surah 15, verse 9, Allah has guarded the Quran. This one has been unchanged. It's perfect. Once again, when we study the early Islamic sources, we find that to be false.
There's actually many stories in the Quran, and only one of them actually has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. All the rest of them pick up in the middle, or they leave off before it's ended. So the Quran is very different, and Muslims don't turn to the Quran like Christians do the Bible. I mean, Christians will go to the Bible for their guidance. Muslims will go to the Imams for guidance, expecting the Imams to explain the Quran to them. But they're not going to go directly to the Quran for any exegesis. They're going to go to their teachers first, generally speaking.
And I start reading the pages of Scripture, encountering this God, and God's pretty awesome. This was a study Bible that my friend David had given me. I would, out of exasperation, I'd say something like, God, how do I know you can even hear me when I pray? And I'd read the footnote. If you want to know that God hears you when you pray, turn to 1 John 5. Sweet, boom, thanks. I'd start reading. And so I'm going back and forth within the Scripture, and I finally get to Matthew chapter 10. And here's what I read in Matthew chapter 10. He who confesses me before the people of this world, I will confess before my Father in heaven. And he who denies me before the people of this world, I will deny before my Father in heaven.
Contradictions between those different
There were, and
versions.
this was the stuff that really began to get me, because as a Muslim, I did not know what I'm about to tell you, which is crazy. Muhammad handpicked 4 teachers of the Quran, again according to Sahih Bukhari. Read book 61 of Sahih Bukhari if you want to know how the Quran was compiled. Of these 4 teachers that he handpicked, 2 of them, one's named Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and the other one's named Ubay ibn Ka'b. These 2 teachers, 2 of the 4 greatest teachers of the Quran, disagreed with today's Quran. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said there should only be 111 chapters. Ubay ibn Ka'b says there should be 116 chapters. Today's Quran has 114 chapters.